Welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Jason Sada. He's the General Manager and Vice President of Axon Sports. We're really excited to have him. He's going to spend some time talking about the athletic brain, so game sense, sports IQ, whether or not that kind of thing can be trained. So really excited to welcome Jason to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks. Good morning. I'm really happy that I'm not presenting the sports benefits of beetroot juice today. If I got to find out what that is first. What I'm going to talk about is really a concept and a principle that we're working with within Axon, which is really focused around training above the neck. And one thing left out of my bio is I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to start with a video as opposed to data. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you a 4-minute video here that really introduces what we're doing in Axon, but also the concept of training the athletic brain, and it'll introduce you to one very significant component of what we're doing, which is a lab that we're fortunate to have in athletes' performance. So I'm going to run the video here and practice thoughtful silence, I think was the term, and hopefully this will give a good overview.
In order to attain mastery in any space, we talk about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000-hour rule, 10,000 hours of perfect practice to attain mastery. Well, here's the thing with an athlete. We may only have 10,000 total hours before that athlete may start to fall apart physically. So we can precisely tune them within their body and keep it as optimal as possible for their position, their style of play, everything. But what we have to do is we had to train above the neck to be able to allow them to see more and more live reps, the things that limit their performance that's happening above the neck.
When we talk about training above the neck, we're really looking at giving tools for athletes to be able to approach their cognitive training much in the way that they approach the physical training. So they do it at certain frequencies. They do it to get better at their specific sport. And through repetition and expert feedback, we enable athletes to really approach it as training their cognitive function. There's quite a bit of different methods of cognitive training. At Axon, we've defined what we consider the athletic brain. And that's made up of several components, including high-speed decision-making, visualization, emotional regulation, focus, reaction, and spatial reasoning. What we've done here at Athletes Performance is we've set up what we call a lab, and where we set it was actually adjoining the training floor. And the reason is we want to really help communicate to the athlete that training above the neck is really a component of training. It's something that you do in conjunction with what you're doing to train your body.
It's about the sport. I mean, these players, the questions that we receive and the interaction that we have with baseball players and football players, it's baseball talk and it's football talk. The perspectives that we have for the hitters, for all the positions in football, it's what they will see at their specific position. And the amount of reps that you can get in a short amount of time really bode well for the development of the brain of the athlete.
When the athlete walks out of Axon and they're beaming and they're saying, hey, I just saw 300 live pitches, when I know that 300 live pitches may have been over a month's work in season. Live pitching doesn't happen very often. Our athletes sing it all the time. Mastery and meeting them where they're at, utilizing technology to help them achieve, that's where it's all at. That's the magic, because it's athlete driven.
What we've really initially been focusing on is what we call our digital skills trainer. And what that is a system where athletes can come in, they can log in, they can identify their sport and position, and get specific training components that they need to develop as athletes for the specific domain that they're in. And part of the reason we did that is we want them to come in, get a very high fidelity training experience, but also engage in the product exactly the way they're going to engage in these products when they're not in the lab. So everything that they're engaging with, the experience, the way that they've learned to train their brain is going to be something that they can then leverage in a mobile environment on iPads during the season.
Having played football most of my life, it's extremely important to train your body, to get bigger, to get faster, to get stronger. But that mental training is something that a lot of people take for granted. And if you really want to separate yourself and be the best player that you possibly can be, you need to start training your brain. And training your brain in a way that is specific to your sport and that applies to your sport from your perspective. And this is exactly what Axon is accomplishing.
We really look at the programs and the science that can be used to help athletes perform at an extremely high level. We really look at the athletic brain as a vehicle for athletes that is trained differently than non-athletes and can certainly be optimized for the decisions, the reactions, the patterns even that athletes have to identify and recognize in game time situations.
When you look at the future is to marry this very sport-specific cognitive training of the athletic brain with this very precisely tuned body, and you have an athlete that redefines sport and performance as we know it today.
Okay, so what we want to accomplish with that video as an introduction is really to introduce not only the concept of the athletic brain, but to, in a short order, communicate what we're actively doing today in an effort to assess and train the athletic brain. So the approach we really took with this is that really it all starts with a story. And the story, and specifically the story in sports, is that the brain matters. It must be protected. I think there's plenty of coverage about concussions and the effects of concussions in sports. We have a business line which is a cognitive baseline that's used at some major universities, Notre Dame, University of Michigan, to give you examples, that is a cognitive baseline for athletes to take when they're healthy, when they're uninjured, to really have a fingerprint of their current cognitive function. So in the event of an injury, they can, after physical symptoms have gone away, there's a metric then to compare against to see whether the brain has recovered. But we also believe that it can be trained. And this presentation really focuses on our approach to training the athletic brain. Our mission really is to develop and deliver cutting-edge tools that assess and train the athletic brain. In addition to the ability to train the brain, we want to have a starting point, the capability of identifying what's different between elite performing athletes. How do we assess that skill? And then, most importantly, once we've assessed it, is it something that can be trained? So in order to do this, we really took the approach of defining something. We felt we need something tangible to talk to so that when we discuss training and athletes, we have a term to reference. So keeping it simple, we stuck with the athletic brain. And we sat down with, and I'll introduce the members of our science board, but we sat down with members of our science board and tried to really take a massively complex subject, which is the brain, and really summarize it in a way that we can communicate to athletes. Because part of the process of training people is having them understand what you're trying to train them. So we took an approach here, and I'll walk through each of these categories quickly, realizing that each of these pieces certainly intermix. They're not in absolute isolation, and there are probably some components of the brain clearly that wouldn't be covered in this. But it's a general guideline and a good way to basically communicate what the athletic brain is. So starting up here at the top is high-speed decision-making. The way we always talk to this to the athletes is it's critical in sports to make high-speed decisions, make them quickly, and make sure that they're correct. Making really fast decisions that are always wrong will probably result in failure, almost certainly. Making perfectly correct decisions late consistently is probably another way to fail. So we really focus in on high-speed decision-making being a true component of speed and accuracy. Going clockwise here, we have emotional regulation and relaxation. An example we use for this oftentimes is free throw shooting. You may be an 85% free throw shooter. You've just gone 0 for 4 from the field in the fourth quarter. You're fouled and you're at the line. You got to shoot your free throw. One of the things preventing you from maybe making that shot is letting your emotions get in the way of your skill. So it's really an area of helping athletes identify and then hopefully train their abilities to control their emotions. Pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. We use soccer as an example for this a lot of times, which is a sport I played. When you're on the pitch and there's 21 other players, at no time as a sport's dynamically changing, things are unfolding instantly and constantly changing. At no time are you counting 21 players and identifying each one individually and exactly where they are. What you're doing is looking out and identifying patterns. You're using space as a significant indicator. In football, one thing we learned is when athletes are coached from what they call the 22 footage, from the camera way up at the top of the stadium, 10 yards looks like a mile. When you go on the field and you look at 10 yards, it's a pretty short distance. So everything that's being taught is from this high perspective, which gives kind of a false sense of spatial orientation. So we bucketed those two together. Visualization and imagination, this kind of touches a little bit on the previous presentation, which is creating tools for athletes to visualize and through really imagination, train motor skills through the brain. So there's been research that's shown that people, through imagination exercises, can actually develop motor skills through the training. The motor system of the brain is active, and if you can activate that in training, that's something we think we want to look into and identify ways to do that. Reaction and anticipation. I always like this one when we talk to athletes because we could pretty much move on after saying reaction. They go, got it, want it, think it's critically important. One thing we point out is that anticipation is critically important. I usually use a boxing analogy. If you are incredibly fast and can react to anything in front of you and you react to everything you see from that other boxer, whether he's punching or not, if you react to everything he does, you're probably going to get knocked out. There's a sense of anticipation. There's visual cues. Experience tells you when you see certain function or certain mechanics, what this person's going to do. So we think reaction is critical, but it, in the absence of a skill of anticipation, probably won't help you perform in sports. Focus and concentration, a lot of expressions for this, quieting the mind, basically the ability to ignore external or even internal distractions and focus on your task at hand. So again, this was put together so we could communicate almost in a layman's terms what we've defined as the athletic brain, because we think it's critically important in our intro statement of train above the neck that this gets approached like the physical domain, like physical training. This is something that's important to athletes, and if explainable, I think people understand. So, what was our first step in setting this up and starting this company was to go identify the top scientists in this space. We're very fortunate to work with these folks. A couple of them are here. Dr. Faddy, who I don't know if any of you attended the pitch recognition presentation yesterday, but one of the products I'll show you is pitch recognition, and it's based on all of the research that Dr. Faddy has done. And one really great thing about how we've put the board together is, for example, Dr. Faddy, his background is in instructional design, because all of the cognitive training in the world can only really be maximized in its effectiveness if we know how to teach it. So instructional design is a critical component of what we do. Scott Fry is really an expert in visualization. Paul Maruff is the Chief Science Officer of Cogstate, and Cogstate does cognitive assessments. That's the company that the cognitive baseline that we use for concussion assessments comes from. Paul Ward, really an expertise guy. Anders Ericsson, the research of high repetition, expert feedback, 10,000-hour rule. And then Dr. Len Zajkowski, who's also here today, really a tremendous innovator in this space. Also a Boston University guy, so I thought I'd throw that in there to, with the affiliations probably here today. But really an innovator in this space and really one of the people on the forefront. So you saw some pictures of the lab in the video piece. The reason we wanted to put that there, and we're fortunate to have Mark Verstegen here as well from Athletes Performance, who's we're really fortunate to be partnering with. But when we first sat down and talked about putting this lab at Athletes Performance, we agreed that it's critical that this lab adjoin the training floor. We don't want people to think of cognitive training as something you leave the world of sports and you enter some sterile environment and enter a hospital room and do your training. We wanted to show athletes that this is as important as training the body. So that lab adjoins the training floor, looks right out into it. What we're doing in this, with this partnership is we're doing cognitive baselining of athletes, so having a baseline understanding of their base cognitive function. And then we've developed our assessment and training programs around baseball and football, and we're starting the implementation right now of basketball and soccer. We also do product refinement and design, and this really is important for us from an athlete efficacy perspective. We want to make sure this matters to the athlete and is something they're going to do and get better from. And then the physiological cognitive optimizations. What is the best way to implement cognitive training in an already defined world of physical training? How do we find out how to fit it in this workflow so that what we train is implementable? So in addition to that, we're going to look at how do we then optimize both the physical and the cognitive sides in conjunction with each other. What's the best time to do certain types of cognitive training? What's the best type of physical activity to follow up a cognitive training session with? A rough example of that is when we do pitch recognition, after we have people do what we call zone hitting, which is they see a occluded pitch and they determine where the ball is going to be in the strike zone, we bring them out to the batting cage and have them just make contact with the ball on a tee. What are we doing there? We're trying to connect the dots to the athlete to show this is what happens in the brain and this is what it feels like in the real world. So that's something that's really important and something that we're excited to develop. And then, of course, future product R&D. We have a roadmap that goes quite a ways out. So I mentioned in the video piece that our DST architecture, Digital Skills Trainer, and that's kind of our launch vehicle for cognitive training. In this architecture, we set it up really as a cognitive function where we look at adaptive learning processes, performance-driven training. It's a cognitive loading system. We start athletes training on a skill. When they've developed some level of mastery of that skill, we start introducing cognitive loads. How do they perform that skill when they're being loaded in other capacities? And that's built into the system. Automated customized training really gets to the fact that this is a system where athletes come in, log in, you saw the login process, and their results are saved, but also within their results gives us a training plan. So different athletes will have different training programs. We have a system that will automatically determine that and allow the athletes to actually engage in training that's relevant to them. Our launch programs are around baseball and football. And the design of this is you saw the facility in the lab, but essentially anything done in the facility can then be ported out to iPads. So athletes can do it, again, thinking about maintaining and performing this training. A lot of minor league baseball players spend their lives on buses. If we have a lab solution that's sitting there and that's our only solution, they're not going to see as many pitches. So we put them on iPads, we make sure it's portable for the athlete. So what I'm going to do, especially since I'm running short on time here, is I'm just going to show you an example of one component of our training. This is running right here off the iPad. This is what would exist on an individual athlete's iPad. So the information contained in it, the number of cards that you see that would be trained for that athlete, would be specific to that athlete and their goals. So we have these cards that the athletes can cycle through because, again, we want people to understand that this type of training is functional. You can do this. There's a real-world domain to this. Cards is a good way for us to communicate that. You'll see here we train for accuracy and speed. We always want to make sure you know the stuff first, and then once you know it and have a skill, you have to do it automatically. Because recognizing a pitch, but taking 8 seconds to recognize it, probably is going to be too late. So we introduce speed as a component of making sure it's automated. It's in your instinct. The minute you see it, you respond to it. It's in your subconscious. So I'm running short on time, so what I'll do is I'm going to go right to level 3, and hopefully some of you saw Dr. Fatty's presentation, but this is occlusion-based training where a pitcher delivers a pitch and we cut off the video. Level 3 is moment of release. The instant that ball comes out of the pitcher's hand, we've been working with athletes and training them to identify pitch type at the moment of release. All right, any guesses? What was that? Curveball, all right. What was the answer? Did you see? So it's a simple thing, but what we do to get higher speed repetition is the minute you get one wrong, we tell you what the right answer is. What is that? Expert feedback. So we made this so that it isolates on the function and the actual activity that matters, which in this case is a pitcher pitching. And then right at that moment of release, you come in, you identify the answer. If you notice a score floating up, we're in accuracy mode. I don't care how long you've taken this. We want to know that you can recognize these things. When you get to speed mode, you could get 100% of them right and have 0 points to show for it. You took too long. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to show you a quick example of something. We use both video and 3D, and we use the combination of them. So one thing we did in football is blitz recognition. So I won't ask you again. I'll pick on somebody else here. So everyone pay attention and tell me which side you think the blitz is coming from in this play. All right, everyone knows, right? You know, everyone knows. Any guesses? We're going to have a Mon guess. Wrong. But you can see what we do here. I'm showing you level 3 just to show you the speed that we do this at. A quarter of a second isn't enough time for saccadic eye movement to scan everything. You have to take it in as one big chunk, one picture, using what? Spatial reasoning, pattern recognition. Also, football knowledge. What tips a blitz? Well, where's that safety? Odds are a guy's not blitzing if he has no help behind him. So we're leveraging the world of sports and the things that matter in sports to combine with science to then make functional training for athletes. As an example on this, we had athletes coming in and we do a coverage recognition drill with quarterbacks, and people came in and level 1 shows it to you for 2 seconds. They did the first drill. These are elite level quarterbacks, and they said that was incredibly fast. I didn't see anything. Well, about 100 repetitions, which was about 3 minutes later, they could start seeing things at 2 seconds. Ultimately, through training over several weeks, they go to a quarter of a second, and that feels normal. You go to 2 seconds, and they're like, this is too much time. Like, what do I do with the rest of my time here? So what we're trying to do is really create that system that it's in your subconscious. You guess, but guess what? You're right. So that's really it. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Morning.
Morning.
At what age do you start this program, and with what frequency should it be applied?
That's a great question.
Just to add to that, is there a difference between male and female athletes?
Okay. So from the age perspective, we base that really on the relevant content. So for example, with a high school athlete, odds are they're not going to see complex disguised coverages on a routine basis. So the training of a skill, let's say it's coverage recognition for a quarterback, is critically important to a high school quarterback, but the content is different. The requirements are different. So we actually developed at Athletes Performance our pro-level training, which is highly complex, and we've created ancillary products that through content modification and requirements modification addresses the needs of the younger athlete. We're really targeting, and we're launching a consumer product this summer that's targeted at what we call the passionate high school athlete. That high school athlete who just really wants to get better. Your second question. We haven't seen any. We haven't looked into it. One thing we're for sure doing, though, is with the female athletes, softball is a great example. An underhand pitch is very different to recognize than an overhand pitch. So we have a softball product that is built around the sport difference between male and female sports. Within basketball and other sports, this video that we're going to use or the 3D that we're going to use, we're going to ensure represents the gender that's on the field. So that, again, the association is there. It's a connection. It's something that they've seen before. It doesn't look different to them. Thank you.
Have you done any studies to see if there's any correlation between video performance and actual performance?
Yeah. So certainly Dr. Fatty's research around pitch recognition showed a significant improvement in on-field performance based on the video occlusion pitch recognition training. So that specific science absolutely has been done. On the football side, we actually took a couple of groups together, some of which were quite knowledgeable football players and some of which didn't know knew what a coverage was but couldn't recognize a coverage. We brought them on the field to assess their skill and whether or not they could identify a coverage. We had a group that couldn't. They didn't know what it looked like. We brought them through. We had them train for about 5,000 repetitions over the course of about a week. And in all cases, when we then brought them back to the field, we didn't reassess them digitally. We reassessed them back on the field. These athletes could identify the coverages quickly. Yes.
What about the difference between being high performing and incrementally higher?
Yeah. So one perspective on that is we have athletes at Athletes Performance that have clearly different levels of performance on the field to begin with. When we bring them in and assess their skill on these programs, we see a differentiation. We see that the better performers on the field have this skill at a higher degree than the others. So that's a starting point. But absolutely what we're looking to do, and that's one critical element to this partnership at Athletes Performance, is to really identify how we can create a difference, identify a difference, train that skill to really get the difference between the elite athlete and the super high-performing elite athlete. That's absolutely where we're focused. I missed just the very beginning of it.
What competencies do you look at when the player makes the team better because of their
You know, it's interesting. It's something we haven't really directly looked at or assessed, but just in experience and what we've seen in the teams we've worked with in the past, a lot of the kind of locker room leaders, if you will, or even film room leaders in football understand the sport from an athlete's perspective. So one thing we're really cognizant of is identifying those people who really are thought leaders that are athletes, because we want to leverage what they're doing and how they understand the sport and how they can even communicate the sport to implement those in our programs directly. At this point, we're looking at skill. And so we really identify it as a level of skill. It's interesting because we see it in action as athletes are training. You'll have a room of athletes, and you'll have somebody who's encouraging others to do it. You'll have somebody who's promoting the value of what they're doing. A bit subjective, but certainly something we're going to be tracking, if you will, in our implementations.
This is more of a statement, but this is a great concept, especially, as a college coach, the limitations that the NCAA puts on, your time and ability to train. And this is very much individually driven. And at that age group also kind of mixes the video games with performance. So if this is really counting towards the 10,000 hours, which, it should,
yes,
this could be really big.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know how much you're getting in the market for, the bigger NCAs, but,
No, actually, that's a perfect transition to what I wanted to just close with. And thank you for the feedback. This is what we're doing this year. We're really looking at team engagements. We've already started discussing this with a number of teams, but we really want to identify 2 college pro-level teams in these various sports to partner with. We want to approach it as something that can work within the workflow of a professional organization. We know that the skills here are invaluable root skills for athletes, but we want to also be able to customize that to each program. So that's what our sights are set on right now. We're working right now to identify those and lock them in so we can start working. Additionally, and I mentioned this, we're going to be launching with some consumer solutions that are a little bit more generic and more targeted toward the high school athlete. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.